Well, what I've uncovered is that right now, for example, they have what they call geoengineering, which is upper atmospheric modification. And one of the things that's been happening is the U.S. House of Representatives has held 3 hearings, one in November 5th last year and 2 this year in February and March, to have some talking about global geoengineering governance, drawing up plans to put up particles and chemicals or do other atmospheric experiments to reduce the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth. And this is ostensibly to cool us down. But the type of chemicals and particles that they're talking about putting in the atmosphere are likely to produce acid rains when they come back down, like sulfur. And they're likely to do other damage to the environment. And when you release the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth, you start to reduce photosynthesis. And without photosynthesis, all plant life will lose the energy to grow. Crop production will be reduced. Without direct sunlight, you start to have a lack of vitamin D and the associated health effects. And so I began to be concerned that reducing the amount of direct sunlight reaching the Earth might not be what we want to do, and that it may not cool us down. And that many of the scientists who were recommending this course of action said, well, we don't know what the consequences are, but we would like to do the testing anyway, so that we can be prepared in an emergency or such to put the chemicals up or whatever we need to do to keep us cooler, to combat global warming. And so I took exception to this because I found out through my research that one of the causes of global warming we could take care of by reducing our pollutants and some of the impacts of aviation, and we could do it very easily and without, in other words, having to resort to things that would harm the environment.
So your research tends to indicate that the persistent jet contrails are along the lines of geoengineering in terms of global warming or preventing global warming.
Yes. I don't think that they're there to prevent global warming. Persistent jet contrails are actually causing global warming because the NASA studies and the Stanford studies and some others, and there's quite a number of them, all show that aviation causes global warming. It exacerbates it, and it also changes the climate. And it's responsible for 20% of the warming over Alaska and the Arctic. And they know that it's directly aviation produced. And what happens is when jets fly and they leave these contrails that persist, besides toxic jet fuel emissions, you have this man-made cloud that is produced. One man-made cloud can last for up to 20 hours. It can cover 4,000 kilometers with either man-made clouds or white haze of some kind. And what it does when it produces these man-made clouds, the combustion process releases water vapor into the atmosphere. Water vapor is a greenhouse gas. So therefore, when you see these man-made clouds that change our climate, they're also exacerbating global warming. And one of the things that we could do is to stop the jets from flying at heights that produce these man-made clouds. So there are things that we can do almost immediately which would start to reduce the problem. The other thing about man-made clouds, according to NASA studies, is that they're a little different than natural clouds in that they hold in and trap more heat. And when they hold in and they trap more heat, they're more humid, you get this heat trap that traps all of the other pollutants, greenhouse gases and other pollutants, so you actually keep the heat from escaping, both during the night and the day. And in trapping the heat, you warm the Earth up. And you concentrate these other pollutants as well. So part of the thing about geoengineering is that we already have this geoengineering experiment, and whenever you see these jets producing the man-made clouds, we're already geoengineering the atmosphere. And so one of the things we should be doing, instead of adding more particles of chemicals to that toxic mix that we already have, we should be finding ways to have the jets run cleaner. We should have them fly at heights where they don't leave trails that persist. And we should start to move in that direction very quickly.
All right, so what can you tell us about the composition of these trails from your research?
Persistent jet contrails from my research are composed of highly toxic jet fuel emissions, which cause agricultural damage, human health problems like asthma. The EPA reports on subsonic jet fuel emissions is quite clear that there's carcinogens in them, that jet fuel is probably, I would judge from their reports, much more toxic than automobile exhaust, and that they release soot and other particles. So the plume, even though it looks white, is loaded with jet fuel emissions that are highly polluting. The second thing is that when you see that trail, the combustion process of a jet engine releases water vapor. And so what happens is you get this greenhouse gas that mixes in with this, and you can have some ice crystals in it or not, depending. But what happens is that this is a highly toxic mix, and its impact on agriculture, human health, all these things is quite high.
Well, of course, you're familiar with the idea that there was a fundamental change in jet contrails between the mid-1990s and late 1990s, and we've seen reports of things like aluminum oxide and barium showing up in tests related to what may or may not be in these trails. What do you say about those reports?
We clearly are having spikes in California. I know because I've gone to the California State Department of Health, and they are the repository of every single drinking water test by every public water source in the state of California dating back to the 1970s. Anyone can get the data free by just requesting it from them, so it's not like a secret. But we went through and we looked at all the data going back from the earliest records all the way up to current records, and we found unusual spiking in barium, aluminum, manganese, magnesium, strontium, boron, and some other chemicals. So we are seeing spikes in those chemicals, and we're seeing direct pH increases in the soil from having aluminum in the soil. We're seeing aluminum in the whales. So a lot of tests are being conducted in the atmosphere using these chemicals. Now, I can't directly relate them to the jets. However, I can directly relate the chemical releases to when we send up rockets. NASA and the U.S. Air Force send up rockets or the space shuttle, and they have these canisters attached. And at different heights in the atmosphere, they release these canisters, and when they're heated, they create an explosion, and they're loaded with trimethyl aluminum or barium and strontium and sulfur hexafluoride and a lot of these greenhouse gases and other chemicals. And so this type of testing has been ongoing for many, many years, probably going on 30 years at this point. So I do have the evidence and the documents and the research and the studies from those particular tests that are in many cases ongoing. And I have the documents from last year when the NASA and the U.S. Navy sent up a rocket over the eastern seaboard of the United States, and they created an aluminum oxide dust cloud. And they were doing research about putting up this cloud of dust, and eventually the aluminum oxide will come down. And then they're talking about doing additional tests, putting up more aluminum oxide and other tests into the atmosphere. So we're chemically beginning to put more and more chemicals into the atmosphere to conduct tests. And the problem is that these chemicals are going to come down. They're going to get into our water supply. They're going to get into our soils. They're going to get into the food we eat. They already are showing high levels of aluminum that can't be explained worldwide in whales tests that they have done. And so part of it is that we have been doing these experiments.
Le premier qui dit la